Bet y'all don't know which one I just learned, did you?
I brought my backpack this morning, didn't you? Doesn't everybody bring their backpack to church on Sunday? You may be carrying your backpack, you may be carrying a lot more than you realize, or maybe you do. This one, for some reason, feels especially heavy. It feels like I've got bricks in this backpack. I'm wondering because it's especially heavy. And the truth is, I have bricks in this backpack. Don't you? Life doesn't necessarily go as we plan, correct? So in our imaginary backpacks, we're carrying very heavy bricks. Bricks of traumatic circumstances that we've experienced over the years. I've had a few. Bricks of losses that we have experienced. Bricks of terrible disappointments that circumstances didn't necessarily turn out as we had anticipated. And so with each of those experiences, you add another brick. And in a sense, you're carrying them in your backpack, even carrying them to a worship experience this morning. Let's press the pause button. Let's take our backpacks off. Let's set it aside. That's a pretty fresh brick right there. I figured James was okay if I took one off the house. She wouldn't mind. You know, it wouldn't affect it cosmetically all that much. So let's just think, what if this morning? What if? What if this morning I just stood up here and you've taken your backpacks off, you released yourself of all the bricks, and I announced to you, I'm going to speak about brotherly love this morning. What would your reaction be? Think, maybe, oh, how sweet. What a sweet topic, brotherly love. And it's a little more than just a sweet topic, because after all, the scripture says in Romans chapter 12, verse 10, be devoted to one another in brotherly love. It's a biblical ideal, so it's not just a sweet topic, it's an important topic. That's not what I'm going to speak about this morning. I hate to disappoint. Instead of speaking of brotherly love this morning, I'm going to speak of nothing but brotherly hate this morning. I don't know how you grew up, but when I was a little kid, I hate to confess this, but I remember on more than one occasion, directed at not one but both of my sisters, I would look them right in the eye and say, I hate you. Did you ever do that? I did. My Southern mother made it very clear that it was not acceptable to say such things. In fact, I recall her saying, we don't hate. Not only was it unacceptable, it was completely off the table. We don't hate. I was told as a little boy, that is simply not an option in our household. We're going to read Genesis 37. We're going to read the story of Joseph and his brothers this morning, and it is most certainly a story of brotherly hate. The first 8 verses of Genesis chapter 37. He begins by referencing Joseph's father, Jacob. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report about them. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made a richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you actually intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dreams and because of what he said. It is a household filled with brotherly hate. Brotherly hate is pervasive in the household of Jacob. And there were obviously several contributing factors to such brotherly hate in this narrative. The text tells us that Joseph brought a bad report about his brothers. You know, a bad report, that's a pretty broad term, is it not? I recall being in elementary school and getting notes sent home to me. My mother would characterize those as bad reports, and I had another characterization of those. I thought that the teacher was misguided. How could it possibly be a bad report? So that's such a broad term. What does bad report mean? But in the original language, it's actually far more descriptive, and there's a little bit of a loss in the translation in English, because in the context, what it really meant was it was a false or malicious report that Joseph brought to his father about his brothers. It was fabricated at worst and exaggerated at best. This really is a bad report. I had a fairly well-known Old Testament scholar for a course on the Pentateuch when I was in graduate school. And I still remember him telling us in class one day, we were talking about this story in Joseph, and when he referenced this bad report that Joseph brought about his brothers, this professor said, this Hebrew scholar says, here's the essence of it. Joseph tattled on his brothers. That's the essence of what occurred here. He tattled on them. It was this malicious report about his brothers. They're in this presence of a richly ornamented robe given exclusively to Joseph. Now, I realize the whole story doesn't revolve around simply the presence of this richly ornamented robe. However, the robe was a real symbol of obvious parental favoritism. And I think it really helps us to realize the destructive nature of the presence of parental favoritism. Joseph was no doubt the favored child, and this robe is such an obvious symbol, this richly ornamented robe. A couple of authors who've written on the story of Joseph had a great quote. I thought it was a little funny, and I may be a little twisted, but here's their quote. These authors, in reference to the robe, said, and I quote, "It was not the kind of clothing you would wear if you were planning to go to work." I found that a little amusing, and yet it's kind of sad, too. It's not the kind of clothing you would wear if you were planning to go to work. This was not tending to the flocks. This is, I'm going to sit back and play Xbox in my richly ornamented robe while my brothers are out working hard in the field. That was the second contributing factor to brotherly hate in this story. Then there was the presence of Joseph's dreams. Now, Joseph actually had two dreams. Just for time's sake, I just read one of them. But there was a presence of these dreams, and they have an obvious theme, do they not? So what do you suppose was Joseph's motive in sharing the content of his dreams with his brothers? I think perhaps there's a simple answer. He was 17 years old. That may be enough. That may be all we need to say. He was 17 years old and he had these brothers, and of course he wanted to convey to them that, yes, indeed, I am superior to you. But nevertheless, it was very obvious that he was trying to convey to them, convey to them some arrogance, convey to them some idea that, oh yes, someday I will reign over you. Oh yes, I am superior. I am more important than you are. Tensions are very high in this family, are they not? And when tensions run that high, there is no doubt something is going to give. Something has to give. You can't have tensions run that high without something finally giving or caving, if you will. Let's read some portions of the rest of the story, beginning in verse 12 of Genesis chapter 37. Here's what happens, and here's how the hate finally, something has to give. Now, his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. I'm going to send you to them. Now, my question before we go any further is, why is Joseph back at the house with his feet propped up in his ornamented robe and his brothers are out there working? So that's actually a pretty significant question. So his reply, very well, he replies, so he said to them, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks and bring word back to me. In other words, go check on them. Gave him ample opportunity to bring still another bad report about his brothers. That potential existed. If you go down to verse 18, so Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan, but they saw him in the distance. And before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Hate has some natural consequences, does it not? In verse 19, here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the desert. Don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty and there was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern, sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, the boy isn't there. Where can I turn now? Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornamented robe back to their father and said, we found this. Examine it to see if it is your son's robe. He recognized it and said, it is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son for many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. Wow. So much deceit, so much hate, a willingness to go back to your father and tell him this fabricated story. Can you possibly imagine? What is going on in this family? I don't believe the term dysfunctional family had been coined during the patriarchal age in which this was described, but the truth is dysfunctional families have been going on since the beginning of time. So what was going on in this family? There was obvious favoritism instigated by Jacob. That was a factor. There was arrogance. As much as I love Joseph's character, the arrogance is obvious, and there was hate that led to acts of violence, and there was outright deceit, which led to such deep grief on the part of Joseph. Family conflict is not what Joseph had planned for his life. Family conflict is not what Jacob had intended for his family either. And I'm wondering this morning if you relate. Can you take yourself and insert yourself into this very story? Last time I checked, all of us grew up in imperfect families. Did you grow up in an imperfect family? I did. And last time I checked, all of us continue to live in an imperfect family in some shape or form. So perhaps you can insert your own family story, a story where there has been tensions and conflict and perhaps even favoritism. And you can identify with one or even more of the characters in this narrative. The truth is, the families we grow up in are families of origin. Those families shape us. They shape who we become. And it continues to shape us well into our adult life. And the truth as well is the families we live in today shape us every single day. And the impact that our family of origin has on our life today is not necessarily what we had planned for our life. I hadn't planned on that. I hadn't planned on there being a history of abuse. I hadn't planned on there being abandonment. I hadn't planned on traumatic circumstances or grief or loss or conflict. And I believe as we think about our life not going as we had planned, the most important question that we can ask, both of this narrative and also of our own personal circumstances, the most important question that we can ask is, where is God? And how is he working in my life? And how is he intervening in my personal circumstances at this very moment? What is he doing? What is he up to? So Joseph is on the receiving end of a lot of hate, a lot of deceit, a lot of terrible things. Is God really active in Joseph's life? Is God really working in Joseph's life? His life not turning out as he had planned. So here are some significant reality checks. Based on what we know of Joseph's life, here's some reality checks. There was some work that needed to be done on Joseph's heart. Would you not concur? There was some work that needed to be done on his heart. Here's a guy who's who's a little bit on the arrogant side, a guy who has the audacity to go check on his brothers while they're out working, wearing his richly ornamented robe. He showed up wearing it. If that's not rubbing it in your nose, I don't know what it is. His attitude needed some growth. There was some work that needed to be done on Joseph's heart. As one writer said, and I'm just going to quote him directly, Joseph was a brash, overconfident, self-centered young man at this stage in his young life. So God is going to prepare him. God is going to prepare Joseph for further service. He's going to use him in some pretty meaningful ways as the story will unfold. But God is going to prepare Joseph for further service through trials and temptations and suffering. It's not going to be easy. This path of spiritual growth for Joseph will ultimately involve abuse and mistreatment, and he's going to experience separation from home and separation from his family as well. And the final reality check is there were lessons he simply could not learn while sitting at home comfortably in his father's house wearing his fancy coat. Isn't that true? Sitting back with his feet propped up, playing Xbox in his coat while his brothers are out working in the field. This next question I think is really significant because I don't want us to walk away this morning with any kind of misunderstanding. By saying that Joseph needed to grow, Joseph's heart really, there was some work that needed to be done in his heart. Am I implying that God is the cause of trauma? And does God condone deceit and hate and acts that are triggered by rage? And the answer is a resounding no. That's the short answer. God is not the author of such things, but yet, I think so frequently in our lives, we quickly assume that if terrible abuse occurs, or if relationships tragically fall apart, or if traumatic sin blights our lives, we automatically assume God is absent. Where is God? He couldn't possibly be present in all these horrible circumstances that I'm experiencing. And nothing could be further from the truth. Because we can say with confidence, certainly God hates sin. God doesn't cause sin, nor does he condone sin. We are responsible. We are responsible for sin. If you look at even this own story and the complexities behind it, lots of individual choices, lots of individual poor choices, lots of sinful actions that led up to this whole situation being what it is. Everybody was involved. Everybody contributed to the family conflict they experienced. So, who was responsible for the mess we just described in Scripture? They all were. But as another author writing on Genesis says, and I want to quote somebody else, yet, he says, yet God's redemptive pathways do not lead around conflict and abuse. Instead, his perfect plan for our lives often takes us right through the eye of the storm. Isn't that true? I don't know about you, I'll just pause. My response to his quote is, I'd sure like to go around, wouldn't you? I don't want to go through the eye of the storm. That sounds really difficult. That sounds painful. That sounds icky. I don't want to be icky. I don't want to experience conflict. I don't want to go through the eye of the storm, but that's often where God leads us in order to test us and to cultivate the perseverance and endurance and faith we're going to need. This is not how Joseph had planned his life. Joseph had not planned on this storm described here in Genesis chapter 37. Being sold as a slave and shipped off to a different country was not in the plans for his life. And yet, in the midst of all the craziness, God never abandons Joseph. I'm going to go just a couple of chapters over to Genesis chapter 39. Just going to read a couple of verses in the very beginning of that chapter in Genesis 39. You recall he was sold to some Midianite traders, and ultimately he ends up in the country of Egypt. So the narrative picks back up. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. So here's a young man who goes from sitting at the house in his richly ornamented robe to being sold. Sold as a slave in a different country. Verse 2 is significant. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything. Wow, that's pretty impressive. And so God was with him every single step of the way. In no shape or form had God exited Joseph's life or was God absent. He was with him. And that's a phrase as we spend some time this summer in the book of Genesis, in this section of Joseph's story. The phrase, the Lord was with Joseph, the Lord was with him, it's a phrase that's threaded throughout the story all the way to Genesis chapter 50. God is never absent. So what about you? As you look at your own personal circumstances and conclude, this is not what I had planned for my life. And you could very well conclude this morning, I really hadn't planned on family conflict either, any more than Joseph had. Because family conflict hurts. And family conflict is personally damaging. Family conflict shapes people's futures for the rest of their life. And you know what it feels like? It feels like carrying a brick in your backpack every single last day, because it has this uncanny ability to accompany you wherever you go. I have a word of reassurance this morning. God knows about the presence of the bricks in your backpack. I hope yours are at least a little cleaner than mine are. Oh, but isn't that the truth? Bricks aren't necessarily clean and pretty. Not only are they heavy, they've got dirt. and they're messy and they're ugly. God knows about whatever bricks are in your backpack, even bricks of family conflict. He's not absent, he is present, and furthermore, he most certainly wants to work on your heart. I believe I can also say with assurance that God's desire is not to provide a cushy life for you while you sit back in your richly ornamented robe, but instead, God's desire is to accomplish his purposes in you, as Romans 8:28 looks over our shoulders. So you say, I hadn't planned on family conflict. Well, I always carry these bricks. Will there ever be a moment I can just set it down, leave the backpack at home? Is there any hope for resolution, hope for reconciliation? So if God is present, how is he working? Tune in next week, and I'll pick up that very thought in the narrative in Genesis next week. I realize this is summertime and school's out in the summer, but church is not out. So we're going to have homework. We're going to have homework every single week. And so here's your homework for next Sunday. Ask yourself, how is God active in my life? Take note of how he is working in your life and in the lives of those who are closest to you. And as you think about our time together next week, how is God active? Go on and read Genesis 39. And if you get a little short on time, you can go on and just read the first 6 verses of Genesis 39, but I'd encourage you to read the whole chapter. And the title for next week is, I hadn't planned on living in Egypt. Maybe you hadn't planned on living in Egypt either. Matt's going to lead us in our invitation song this morning.